Okay, so getting straight into it, we are looking at a common question that every generation, the same complaint comes from parents. What's wrong with teenagers today? Why are they so moody? Why are they so reckless? Why don't they listen? Why do they engage in risky behaviours? In order to really understand some of the behaviours of teenagers, we have to have a look at how the brain works. And in actual fact, there's been a lot of research over the decades into brain and the teenage brain in particular. And Harvard Medical School were looking at why do accidental deaths, homicides and binge drinking seem to spike or peak in teenage years? And why are psychosis, eating disorders and addictions most likely to take hold during these adolescent years? And what's more frightening, I think, is that there's a lot of research now saying that unhappiness seems to peak in late adolescence. And it's not only the Harvard Medical School research, but a lot of research to date that's looking into that. So I'm talking about the teenage brain, and what we need to do is actually have a little bit of a biology lesson, just a little bit, in order to better understand why teenagers behave in the way that they do behave. And what we know is that at birth, the baby's brain is about a quarter of that of an adult. And at the age of 2, probably about 3/4 equivalent to an adult brain. And by the age of 6, it's pretty much equivalent in size and volume to that of an adult. And what that means is the structures are in place. The grey matter, the brain's wiring, is pretty much there. And in fact, by the age of 2, there are trillions of connections in the brain, double that of an adult. And what happens is why that is because the more stimulus that a child gets, the more connections and wiring occurs. And the more you use and reuse it, that part, those connections, those neural pathways actually become from grey matter to white matter because they become more stable and they get locked into learning and memory. But on the other hand, what happens if it's not used, if that wiring isn't used, it becomes pruned, is what we call in technical terms, but it becomes lost. It becomes it just doesn't function anymore and we lose it. And that's why we talk about the importance from a young age for children to be in a routine and to rehearse and practice certain behaviours so that they remain in the turn into white matter of the brain. So in other words, that they stay there as a behaviour. So looking a bit further, we know that the brain is divided into different sections. And why I'm wanting you to have a little look at this picture, because you can see how the brain's divided into different sections. And growth and pruning occurs at certain times, usually around infancy and also around adolescence. And see if it does. The cerebellum, which is at the back of the head, the point I'm trying to make with this is the development of the brain, it starts maturing right from the back of the brain where that cerebellum is, and it goes up to the frontal lobe. And that takes about 25 years on average for all the connections to be made together and with the rest of the body. So it's not something that just happens all at once, and we often call it in lay terms maturation, but it's that refining and the connections made between the neural pathways around the brain that connects with the rest of the body. And what we need to know about that is that that frontal lobe, that part of that brain, is responsible for what we call the executive functioning, the cognitive functioning. So it's the part of the brain that controls emotions, it controls mood, it controls our ability to make decisions in an informed way, in a considered way. So we call it that executive functioning part of the brain. But it takes from birth to about 25 years old, on average, for it to actually all be connected together. And that impacts on the teenager's behaviour. So what do we know about teenage behaviour? We know that teenagers are known to be risk takers. And keeping in mind that the brain doesn't fully develop, as I said, till about 25 years old, it helps us better understand why they engage in that sort of behaviour. So here, if we're looking at the adult brain and the teenage brain is more guided by the limbic system. And the limbic system is that part of the brain that's more responsible for the instinctual responses. It's the emotional centre of the brain. It's the part of the brain that's the pleasure centre. It enjoys risks. It actually seeks out risks, and it responds usually in an emotional way. Unlike the adult brain, which has the ability to regulate those risks and regulate the mood and the impulsive reactions that a teenager might experience through the thrill of that limbic system. So what this is saying is that that part of the brain is not developed yet in adolescence like it is with adults. So we have to keep that in mind. Peer pressure. That's something else that teenagers very much get involved with. And if we look at MRI scans on adults and teens, we can see that their brains react very differently when they're having these MRI scans in terms of when they're in the presence of their friends. What happens is that limbic system I spoke about before, where dopamine is actually the pleasure centre. So when they're in the presence of friends, what happens? Of course, it feels good that you want to do because you're stimulated by that. And that ability to not engage in the risky behaviour, teenagers don't actually have that development yet in order to really give it considered thought. They can think about it. There is development there, but it's not matured enough in order to do it in a speedier way. For example, if I know that I'm on a diet and I don't want to eat that chocolate cake, as an adult, I will see it on the table and I will say, love that, no, not going to have it, because I can think like that and think of the consequences. I can make the decision. I know that it's not good for me. A teenager who's also on a diet will go past and go yummy because their pleasure centre, the dopamine, starts going. And what's going to happen? They are going to know, maybe, no, the pleasure overrides it, and they don't take the time to actually spend because it's not as strong for them as the pleasure centre is giving that dopamine kick, and they're likely to eat it. Maybe regret it later, but at the time, they will certainly eat it because that's what happens. Intelligence. We used to think that intelligence remained stable over a lifetime. But what we're finding now is that at birth, like I mentioned before, that grey matter is there. The more stimulus in the environment, the more stimuli in the environment, the more complex that grey matter becomes. And then what happens is at certain stages, pruning occurs. So what that means for behaviour is if you don't put it in, rehearse it routinely, and you go through that pruning, you can lose that information that you wanted to retain. For example, just to make it clearer for you, if you want to learn a second language. If you started at a young age, through that stimulus, those neural pathways will be developed. The more practice, the more routinely that you're doing it, it goes from grey matter to white matter, and it'll stay pretty much with you forever, with a bit of practice along the way. On the other hand, if you don't like a subject, for example, maths, and you learn some maths and you don't practice it and do it and rehearse it, when pruning occurs, those neural pathways die off, and to learn it again, it's not impossible, but it's far more challenging. So that's why at a young age, it's much easier to do a lot of things before the pruning occurs so that it goes into memory and stays with us. Attention and concentration. That's an interesting one because as I'm mentioning about all this grey matter with lots of stimulus in the brain, if we look at the colour coding on that slide, we can see from MRI scans that what happens is at the age of 12, at young adolescents, young teenagers or just before teenagers, they've got so much stimulus in the brain, lots and lots of this grey matter. It becomes very confusing and very challenging when they have lots of information coming in. But as they age and pruning takes place, you can see that the grey matter decreases, still overloaded at the age of 16, but by 20, it's pretty much been streamlined, and whatever isn't used and reused has died off, and it's much easier for people to retain information at that age than it is at a younger age when they don't have as much grey matter. Okay, emotional regulation. What we know from Deborah Yerglin-Todd, who is an academic at the University of Utah, and her particular interest was in emotional regulation. And what she wanted to do is investigate how teenagers and adult brains respond differently because of the brain, the teenage brain and brain development, to actually recognising the emotions in other people. She knows that teenagers from the limbic system, we know that they can actually experience the emotion, but can they read it? Do they have the cognitive function to actually understand and read an emotion in somebody else? So in her research, she put this picture up and she asked, what emotion is this person feeling? So on your tables or wherever you're seated, if you have a little chat with the people next to you, see if you can identify what's the feeling. What is that person feeling at that time, do you think? Okay. Adults, 100% of her sample, the adults, said fear. Teenagers, on the other hand, only half of them recognised the emotion as fear. The other 50% identified confusion, sadness, anger, and shock. And I was one of those shock, because that's what it looked like to me. But that's what it was. But I think the message here is that they don't all read it. They don't all read it in someone else. So if you're showing an emotion to a teenager, don't assume that they'll pick it up, because they might need for you to talk it through. They don't necessarily see it or are able to interpret it. Very interestingly, I've been speaking about the teenage brain, but there's some research that's out there that talks about the teenage brain being a myth. And Robert Epstein did some research, and he said that it doesn't always have to be strictly biological. We have to also consider the impact of social factors, because not all teenagers behave in this way. Not all of them are so rebellious or talking back or whatever. And he did research that looked at other cultures that are non-American, and said in his research that teens who spend more time with adults and who are socialised in a certain way are less likely to engage in those behaviours. So it's not clearly defined, and I guess it's the old nature-nurture issue that we could sit here and debate for quite a while, but something to think about. Okay, so given that, what's been happening over the generations? We know now a little bit about the brain. Let's have a look. We often give titles to generations, and we've got the greatest or silent generation, and they're people who are about in their early 70s to mid-90s at the moment, and they represent about 5% of the world population. Baby boomers, and I'm a baby boomer. I don't know if there are any other baby. John, you be a baby. I think we're about it. Oh, Leonie. So we've got baby boomers, and they're people between the ages of 52 and 70 and represent 15%. And of course, the three of us are around the 52 end of that. So they're the baby boomers. We've got Generation X, which I think a lot of you might be, and they're people between the ages of 36 and 51 and represent about 20% of the world population. And we've got the millennials. And millennials are between the ages of 19 and 35, and represent 27%, and are very much Generation Z. Gen Z, or as Twenge calls it, the iGen, represent 32% of the world population. And they're between the ages of 0 and 18. So if we have a look at some of the differences in the generation, we can see that the silent generation, well, they communicated by letter. Their biggest technology milestone was a car, and their hobby was reading. We've then got the baby boomers, and of course, the telephone. What an amazing thing. We couldn't get off the telephone. And the TV, got the TV, we even got colour TV, wow. And watching TV was our thrill, what we did with friends, come over and let's watch a show together, and families watch together. Gen X, they started with the email and wow, SMS. And their technology milestone was a PC, very modern. And surfing the internet is what they did for fun. Millennials, wow, instant messages. Smartphone, everyone needed a smartphone. You couldn't just have one of those non-smart phones, you needed a smartphone. And video games, we all know what they do for hobbies, those dreaded video games. And our Gen Z, our teenagers, what do we have? They communicate with emojis. They use augmented reality. They don't have to buy a painting. They can project it on the wall. Virtual reality, they don't need to go to Paris and go to the Eiffel Tower. They can put them on their eyes and they can go there and not leave the classroom. No more excursions. And music streaming, they all streamed. You stream it. That's what you do, you stream it. That's what we're told. And then we've got the silent generation. They are what we call pre-digital. If you ask anyone that age, they can't even fathom it, even if it's there. We've got the baby boomers, who are the digital immigrants. We all had to learn the technology because we had both. You've got Gen X, who are the early digital adopters. And of course, the millennials were natives. They grew up with it. But the Gen Z, it's innate. It's just within them. And if we look at the key life questions, the silent generation, how did the country go wrong? So wrong. Look, they had two world wars, Great Depression. You've got the baby boomers. Everything was Viagra. Where's the Viagra? Gen X, what's the point? Whatever. That's their communication there. Millennials, what's a career? And Gen Z, what's a landline? You show a Gen Z a digital phone with a dial, they have no clue what it was, let alone the push button. So there have been changes over the time with our generations, but something that's really prominent now, doesn't matter what country or where you're from, is the internet. And what we know is that in 2016, there were 3.26 billion people using the internet globally. In 2017, we've got 3.74 billion people using the internet. And that is an increase of 500 million in 1 year. And that's just from 2016 to 2017. And if we look deeper, we can have a look at various countries and how they're positioned. And if we target Australia, we can see in a population of over 24.5 million people, we've got over 21 million people using the internet. And looking at China, wow, nearly 1.4 billion people, and they've got nearly 750,000 people using it. And then if we look down the bottom, a smaller population, we've got Singapore with just over 5.75 million people, with 4.7 million using the internet. So if we look at it in terms of statistics, in percentages, we've got 86% of Australians using the internet. And looking at across those countries, you can see how many people across the board use the internet regularly. So we can see that even though I mentioned Singapore as having the smallest population in my sample, you've still got 81% of them using the internet, which is a pretty mean feat for so many. And what we do know also is that of all the continents, Asia is the most significant user of the internet globally, with 50.1% of people using it, as opposed to Europe, in comparison, where it has 17% of people using it. And interestingly, of course, not surprising, that China has the largest number of users, and their number of users in China is actually double the population, the total population of the United States of America is just the internet users in China. What else do we know? We know that there are 2 million new blogs posted every day. We know that there's 5.5 billion Google searches every day. And we also know that mobile devices are being used far greater than desktop. And that most people use it, 82% of people are using it. Why? For researching purchases in the store. That's why they're using it. And if you notice here, you can see lots of images. Yes, you can see all those little icons. There are words under it, but lots of icons. Why is it that they've got those icons there? Why are those images there? Anybody have any idea? Sort of. Because people process images 60,000 times faster than text. And 90% of the information transmitted to the brain is visually based. What are you going to remember tonight from tonight? Lots of the images that I've been showing you, the pictures, quicker than the actual text. And let me see if you can actually check your knowledge. What's that an image of? Instagram, well done. What about that one? Facebook. Okay. Twitter. Oh, yes, I am giving you the easy ones first. What's that one? YouTube. I can know what you guys do. Okay. That one? WhatsApp. LinkedIn. Okay. Try those. On your table, have a go. Okay, I'll help you along a bit. Android, Skype, WordPress, Pinterest, Spotify, HTML5, PayPal, Tumblr, Vimeo, and Dropbox. Yes? Anyone get them all right? See, I thought I could get you. Okay, what we also know is that 2.7 billion active social media users in the world. And that's an increase of 21% over the previous year. And if we have a look at the Australian data on that, we can see that 17 million Australians are using Facebook and 15,600,000 are using YouTube. And they're the two main ones, and the other ones are shared with those other social media. And if we have a look at the most recent Australian Bureau of Statistics data, we can see that the 15 to 17-year-olds are the group who spend the highest number of hours per week on the internet. And what's particularly scary for me is they're saying that they spend about 18 hours a day. But that was, 18 hours a week, but that was from 2014 to 2015. Can you imagine now, 2017-18, what those figures would be? And it won't be less. It certainly won't be less than 18 hours a week that they're using it. And what are they using it for? Why are they using it? Not surprising, social network. That they've got 90% of those 15-year-olds are using it for social network, formal education and entertainment. They're wanting to see what's on. What else do we know? We know that 9 in 10 Australian teens now have a mobile device, 94% have a smartphone, and most are already onto their second or subsequent handset. And that was done by Morgan Research. 91% of 16 to 24-year-olds use the internet for social networking. And what we also know from Twenge's research, and I'll introduce you to her later, is that it's linked with increased rates of anxiety, depression, and poor sleep. So it's something that we have to look into. We know that some teenagers, and if any of you have teenagers, you will know that they lose track of time when they're online. They check their email several times a day. They spend time online instead of doing homework and being with their friends or family. They often develop relationships with people that they meet online, and they lose interest in activities that they used to find enjoyable before they got online. Often they lie about the amount of time that they spend online, and they ignore time limits that might have been set for them by family members. And they become agitated or angry when they're interrupted, angry and irritable if they're not allowed access, if they're banned, irritable, moody, or depressed when they're not online. And when they're not online, they're often preoccupied with getting back online. And they sacrifice a lot of sleep that they need in order to spend time online. So they use language that we call teen speak. And now I'm going to test you again. Yep, we know that one. Laugh out loud. You know I'm starting with the easy ones first. Any idea? Let me know. Okay. Any guesses? Well, we know all about this audience. Let's have sex. Okay, what about that one? Yep, parenting room. Now you know why they use it, because you don't know what it means. Have a look at those ones. Pretty scary. They can have a whole conversation that you've got no idea what they're talking about. As I mentioned before, Twenge did some research, and it was about whether smartphones are destroying a generation. And her research was focused on using correlational measures. And for those of you who aren't as familiar with what that means, it means that there's an association. It doesn't mean that it's a cause. So we have to be very careful when we look at this research to make sure that we know that they are associated, but we're not saying, or she's not saying, that it's causal. But what she found, that teenagers are going to fewer parties and spending less time together because they don't need to. They can be in their bedroom, on their bed, with their smartphone, and they can be on social media and watching the world and what everybody's doing, and they don't have the need to actually go out in the rain or go out wherever they have to go or used to go before, because they could actually do virtually the same in their eyes just from their homes. And what happens is they're going to those fewer parties, spending less time with their friends in person, still spending it online, but not in person. And what happens with that is they're documenting their time when they're out at the parties. You know what it's like. They've got their phone with their friend and click, 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 and they're taking photos of the party and the food and everything else that's going on. And it goes straight up on their social media within a second. And what happens? FOMO, big time. Fear of missing out. What's happening is the teenagers who aren't there are seeing it through the social media and feeling like they're missing out. Years ago, you could have a party and leave someone out and they'd never know, because you'd say to everyone, don't tell them. Don't say that you're invited. But now it's very hard to do that, because somebody is going to post it up there, and if you're friends and liked and all that by everybody, they're going to see it. And what we found, or what she found also, is that girls, 48% increase in their experience of feeling excluded over the years 2010 to 2015. And there's been an increase also in boys of half as much, but still it's on the rise. And the reason that girls are more likely to feel it than boys are because they use social media more often, and therefore they're going to feel excluded more often than males do.
It's very interesting, because in your research you find all these different correlations saying that, the iGen generation, they literally just don't go out of the house as much as previous generations.
Right.
They're not even getting their driver's licenses as early as older generations because there's a lack of independence that's manifesting itself.
Yeah. So this is part of a trend that was accelerated by smartphones, but started with millennials and has really deeper cultural roots. So this is the trend toward teens growing up more slowly, taking on both the pleasures and the responsibilities of adulthood later than they used to. So things like driving, a lot of them are not getting their driver's license even by end of senior year of high school, going out on dates, going out without their parents, having a paid job, drinking alcohol, having sex during high school. iGen teens do those things less than teens used to.
It was very interesting reading your article, and I'll quote from it here. It said, the average teen now has sex for the first time in the spring of 11th grade, a full year later than the average Gen Xer. It seems counterintuitive. So we always thought that age was getting younger and younger, and now the trend is going back the other way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because it did, from boomers to Gen Xers. So I'm a Gen Xer. We kind of started adolescence a little earlier than the boomers did, and then we extended it as long as we possibly could. So with this generation, with iGen, they're kind of extending childhood into adolescence. So that comes up in ways like having sex and drinking alcohol, where many people, especially parents, would be like, isn't that a good thing? And I would say, of course, yes, that's a wonderful thing. But it's a trade-off because they're also, with not going out of the house as much, not driving, not having a job, they're also not having as many experiences with independence. And then when they get to college or get a job, then sometimes they don't know exactly what to do because they just haven't had as much experience making decisions on their own.
So what her research found, that the rates of anxiety and depression over the last 25 years has increased. What she also found is that since 2011, teen suicide has increased significantly. Whoops. And what she attributes it to is the association of her research, her correlational research, which shows that there's 35% more likely to have a suicide risk factor if they spend more than 3 hours a day on the internet or on social media in particular. So that is some of her Twenge's findings. And she talks a bit about internet addiction, and some parents are loosely saying my child's addicted to the internet. And as a psychologist, we're very careful about using terminology like addiction. We know that teenagers' video games are very important through the way that they socialised, and that we know that they also like to keep in touch with the social media, and that there is a relationship between that and depression and social behavioural disorders. But what we have to be very careful about is that having an addiction is more than just a strong desire. So we don't use that word very loosely. We've got to be careful that it's not a strong attachment to their mobile phone that we're talking about, or to the internet, which most teenagers will have. There's a big difference when we're talking about an addiction. Like other behavioural disorders, like gambling, when we're talking about having an addiction, it's very much about the loss of control or ability to actually regulate that behaviour. They have a clinical disorder that they can't. Whereas a teenager often will not be happy, like I said. They'll be angry, they'll be furious, they'll be whatever. But they actually, if they had to, can put that phone down. So we've got to be very careful on the way that phones and internet are being portrayed. Nomophobia. That's another thing that's going around in the media that we have to be very careful. No mobile phone phobia. And that's where nomophobia is. And we can look at a lot of that information that's out there, but we have to be very careful because there isn't such a thing as nomophobia. These are just key terms that people are using for their own purposes. But what we do know is that there are some people who are more vulnerable to problem internet use. There are people, and not surprising, those who are already struggling with depression, ADHD, anxiety, low self-esteem, low confidence. You know, those who have pre-existing certain clinical problems, clinical disorders, are more likely to fall into having an addiction with the internet. What do we know about that happiness and children's screen? Because we said before that unhappiness peaks in late adolescence. What we know is that from the National Institute of US on Drug Abuse, that teenagers who spend more time on average on non-screen activities, in other words, with family or friends, are more likely to be happy. We also know that 8th graders, which are those in their around 14 years old, who spend 10 or more hours a week on social media, are 56% more likely to say that they're unhappy than those who spend less time. And those who spend less time, like 6 to 9 hours a week, are 47% more likely to say they're unhappy. So the less time that you spend on it, the more chances you are of being happier. And those who spend above average amount of time with their friends in person are 20% less likely to say they're unhappy. So again, it's saying the same thing. The less time on the internet, the less likely they have to report being unhappy. The more time teens spend looking at screens, especially social media, the more likely they are to report symptoms of depression. Again, not necessarily causal, but there is an association between screen use and depression. Other important issues for teens: sleep. Teens should get about 9 hours of sleep a night, and a teen who's getting less than 7 hours a night is significantly sleep deprived. In just the 4 years from 2012 to 2015, 22% more teens surveyed in America were getting 7 hours or less sleep. Teens who spend more than 3 hours a day on electronic devices are 28% more likely to get that low level of sleep than those who spend less than 3 hours. So if they're on screens for less than 3 hours, they shouldn't be as affected. But those who are spending that, it does impact on their ability to sleep. Children who use a media device right before bed are more likely to sleep less than they should, more likely to sleep poorly, and more than twice as likely to be sleepy during the day. Not surprising. So what Twenge started looking at is the relationship between smartphone use and depression. And we know that smartphone use can be causing lack of sleep. We know that it can be causing or related to depression, but there might be another factor that is causing both the depression and lack of sleep that we actually haven't considered. That third factor, didn't show.
What do you think it is about social media? And I think we could maybe separate the phone experience itself from social media, but they're pretty
intermingled.
I mean, what is it about the experience that is inherently depressing? Is it fear of missing out? Is it constant distraction? Is it 24/7 peer group interactions?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is, if it's used in moderation, an hour a day, 2 hours a day, there actually aren't any negative effects for mental health. It's at 2 hours a day, 3, 4, 5, and beyond where you see the effects showing up. So I think it suggests that it's only partially the phone and social media per se. It's what it's crowding out when you're spending that much time on it. That if you're spending so much time on that, maybe you're not exercising, maybe you're not seeing your friends in person as much. And those two things, exercising, spending time with friends in person, study after study after study shows those are linked to better mental health. So it's only partially some of the pressures around the phone and waiting for likes and that type of thing. It's also what you're not doing because you're on the phone.
Because it's crowding out those other more healthy experiences.
Exactly.
So that's the third factor. When you're spending, or when your teenager is spending so much time on social media or screens or devices, it's not only the impact of those screens on them, it's what it's stopping them from doing that they need to be doing, like those in-person interactions, exercise, etc. So what can we do about it? Okay, we know there is an issue. What can you do about it? The very first thing you need to do is educate yourself. Delay buying your child a smartphone for as long as you can hold out, as long as possible. But when you get to that point where you can't, because you have to buy for all those reasons that they've given you, if you can't beat it, join it. And what that means is become involved in your children or grandchildren's online world. You have to familiarise yourself with it. Parents need to become familiar with the internet and social media and learn all those terms that I was showing you before, plus all the new ones that are going to come, that might have already come since I created those slides. But you've got to know them so that you can talk the talk and communicate with them. Have regular conversations while you're still respecting their privacy, because there's nothing more annoying than when you get onto their Facebook account or whatever and start spying. They don't like that. So have genuine conversations with them about it. Know where and how they're using their technology. Make sure that you become part of it. And also meet and share with other parents and teachers at school. Discuss it with them, be open about it. Share ideas. Others might have really good strategies, or you can offer some really good strategies that work for you. The second point is to educate your teenagers. Don't assume that the teenager fully understands the impact of the technology that she or he are using and why you're concerned. Remember that frontal lobe development? They don't have that full development. So they don't really understand unless you sit there and really explain to them why you're concerned or how it can impact their development. The traditional means of educating about technologies are removed. And I've had so many people say they are not allowed to use it at the dinner table. They're not allowed to have their phones turned on at certain times or what have you. Very strict rules, and it's almost like a punishment, the way it comes across. They're banning the internet. And if we look at problems with this method, what's going to happen now, the teenagers are going to keep their issues to themselves. They're not going to discuss it with you because they're going to be punished if they say, I saw something on the internet. You're on the internet again. So you have to make sure that you keep those channels open. And you don't want to be an unhelpful parent by doing that. And also they can have some withdrawal symptoms if you're too rigid about it. So you have to be very understanding. And evidence-based means of educating them opens the lines of communication between you. You're talking their language. You have to be able to communicate with them and distinguish the difference between online and in person. So when they say, but I've been with my friends, we've been talking, chatting all day or all night, chatting online is very different to chatting in person. So you have to explain to them why that is. And the difference between play and productive, because most schools now from young ages are giving them iPads and technology, and we have to know what the difference is between using it for productive reasons and for other reasons. And with that open line of communication, if there's cyberbullying or other things that you can discuss with your child if they don't feel they're going to be punished when they start talking about it. So, very important. The third point is to establish boundaries. Very important is finding a balance between their exercise, their in-person time with their family and friends, and with their use of the internet. Teenagers must communicate with their parents together in establishing the rules of what is going to be reasonable for internet use for that person and, for that matter, the family. You know, if they're going to put the phone down as a teenager, that means everybody does, or whatever the rule might be. Monitor adherence to the rules and also have a clear consequence if they're not kept. So rather than just saying that's the rule, it's important that you actually adhere to them and have a consequence. But most important is when you are setting those rules is that decision-making process of how and when it's being used is made by the teenager with the parents, that the process together is made, because if teenagers have an input in that decision-making process, they're more likely to actually stick to it because they're part of it. They've got some control over it and feel empowered like they would in any other behaviour that you're trying to work with them to change. Most important, make sure you role model the appropriate behaviour and lead by example. A lot of what I've said today, I'm talking about teenagers, but I'm sure that you can identify. How often do you look at your smartphone? What's the last thing you do before you go to bed? What's the first thing you do when you wake up? And when you're telling your child not to use the mobile phone or have their smartphone turned off at the dinner table, it's not okay to say, yeah, but I could be getting a work call so I can have mine on. You have to make sure that the rules are generated that sound like you're able to role model the behaviours you expect in your child. And in conclusion, just to summarise what I've spoken about, teenage brains are not fully developed until they're around 24 years old, as I mentioned before. And much of the behaviour is guided by their emotions, that limbic system, that pleasure centre of the brain. They don't have that development, that executive functioning that comes until the early 20s, early mid-20s. Some people even say 30. Most teenagers take a long time to consider consequences, and they're more likely to make decisions based on what feels good rather than using that cognitive processes. We looked at generational studies and research into the internet, and there's clear evidence that digital technology is definitely here to stay, and it's increasing on a daily basis. So it's not something that we can think is going to go away. It's actually going to become more and more prolific in all parts of our lives. And researchers such as Twenge raise concerns about teenagers' mental health, but we have to be very careful that we know that it's not necessarily causal, but there is a relationship. So we need to guide teenagers into the correct use of the internet and social media and model the correct behaviours ourselves. We have to engage in the use of technology with them, just like you used to play ball and other activities with your child or with your teenager. This is no different. Educate them about our concerns and the evidence-based consequences of overuse. Don't assume that they understand. And include them in the process when setting the rules in the use of digital technology, because, as I said, if they're part of that process, they'll take some control, they'll take some responsibility. And by embracing digital technology and ensuring our teenagers use it in a balanced and moderate way, we're helping to safeguard their mental health. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. How engaging is that? And what appropriate use of the technology, fitting perfectly with the topic and in our fantastic new building. Pretty cool. Now, we've just got a few minutes, but I'm sure Nikki would be happy to take a few questions. Yeah, Kitty. There's a microphone coming.
I started looking at this at the start of my PhD and decided it was a tsunami I couldn't deal with. But the main thing that I was looking at, and you hinted at, but then I don't know if any more research has been done since I looked at it, was the limits that we put on children in terms of for play versus productive. Is all the guiding rules are around 2 hours of screen time a day, blah, 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 blah. But it's for entertainment purposes. Has anyone looked at those figures, like what you said, with the more time you spend on screens, the more likely, more symptoms of depression? Does that make does that distinguish between play and productive or not?
I think what we're talking about are a few different things, because it's like a onion with lots of layers. So when you're on screen time, you're missing out on the other. So it doesn't matter what you're using the screen time for. When you're engaged online, work or otherwise, you're not out there doing the other things. So that there is research. Unfortunately, it's a very new area in research, and there are a lot of studies being done, but not too, I mean, it's coming out, it's new. So I haven't seen specifically on the qualitative differences between what you're using it for, if that makes a difference in terms of mental health. If you're using it for work or for play sort of thing.
Because I'm thinking that maybe as teachers or schools, we have to be careful as to how often we insist that.
For sure.
That, like, I went to my daughter's parent-teacher night, and the teacher spent 5 minutes telling me that my daughter was doing all her work in her exercise book and not on the Surface Pro that she's been given, and really this is how she should use it. Then when I spoke about my PhD and I said it was about sleep, she goes, "Oh, we should get those kids off those devices." And I said, "You've just spent all this time telling me that my daughter is not on her device enough, yet here, you know," so there seems to be a double standard when it comes to these things.
And some of the research is conflicting, like you're saying, and the research on sleep, and I think I jumped one of the slides that wasn't there, but what it actually was saying is that the problem with the sleep, largely, is that every time it beeps, you know, your phone, if you get a message or something, it disturbs their sleep because kids have it right next to their beds. Or the light that comes, if a message comes through, it disturbs their sleep. So whether one of the rules is that you turn the phone off and it goes into the other room during sleep would make a difference to quality of sleep, not only the amount of time that you're using the device. So there are a lot of other confounding factors. I don't think it's as clear-cut.
Any more? Yep. Microphone's on its way.
Thank you so much. I'm actually want to share my opinion about the other aspect that we can see about the social media platform itself. So we have to pay attention on what is inside of the social media itself. Let's pay attention to Facebook, Instagram, or YouTube. And even though the girl in the video say that the negative impact that the children or the teenagers can get, they will not go out of the house and then they will not try to get a job. But unfortunately, nowadays, the platform actually opened the access for children or teenagers to make money by using that platform. So now I'm actually also a content creator of YouTube and Instagram, and what I explore is that the teenagers nowadays try to spend more time and energy in the house only to access the internet because they can get a lot of money from that platform. And the impact as well, the parents actually support the teenagers to do more things on the social media because they can get also money from their children. So that's actually very, very wild right now because the platform itself do not have filter, do not have any a certain regulation that can limit those people who actually get money from the platform itself. So this is actually another aspect.
I'd like to read your study. You do some research on that. Would be really a good study for you to do, and look at that. I think that'd be very interesting.
Thank you. Last one.
Hello. I've got a 15-year-old daughter who goes to one of the major schools in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and one of the policies is bring your own device. So it is in their curriculum and compulsory that all kids have to have their devices. So I wonder what your opinion on this is. To what extent should schools actually reinforce that use of devices, because it does seem to be overwhelming. It's what, it overwhelms children. It creates a legitimate reason for them to be on their devices non-stop, because it's, I'm doing homework kind of thing, but of course, probably 1% of it is true. So second part of the question is, again, I can't get rid of this feeling that they are being guinea pigs, digital guinea pigs, basically, and the technology is being tested by schools to, how it works, how they go with that. So I wonder what your opinion on this is. Yeah, thank you.
To answer the first part of your question, I'm not sure if your concern is the fact that they're using the devices, the digital, like the iPads or whatever it is, and you're not sure whether they're using it for the right reasons totally, or that they're using it all the time and they're not.
The fact that it's compulsory and it's hard to
regulate their use is your concern. Yeah.
Stop using it now, you've had enough. There's always that excuse, oh no, but we have homework on our device.
So it's to do with yourself and as a parent with your child and monitoring when they come home, when they say, I have to use this device to do my homework, it's compulsory, and you're not convinced that it's necessarily all homework, and it might be a bit of the what's on Saturday night happening. Yeah? And that's why the communication between you and your child in its use and watching them, some of those slides that I was saying, be part of their online world, know what they're doing, let them feel comfortable with you doing it, understand how they're using it, and don't treat it like that they feel they're going to be punished. So it's the relationship you have with them, with their device, as the first part of your question. With the second part, just remind me, because I got caught up now, it was... All right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you're saying in terms of, you mentioned before about whether they're guinea pigs. I think as the research is going to be done over time, one of my concerns is, can they write with a pencil a full grammatically sound sentence, or is it going to be PG writing in code? and with emojis, because most of them communicate with emojis and these images. So are they able to put a proper sentence together? And there will be research being done, but it's such a new field that not much, I mean, it's starting to become published, but it's a very new, and I don't think there's any long-term studies that I know of that actually are looking into the long-term effects of a whole gamut of aspects of using digital technology. Oops.
Thanks, Nikki. Last question.
Yeah, last question, because my studies in here, education faculty, that's my research was involved in ICT in education, where I had to question my earlier learning without technology, that knowledge base, together with oncoming onto ever increasing technology in Australia. And actually that stopped me completing my PhD because I had to go back to the real world. And now I'm practicing as a one-on-one cognitive development consultant, where I question myself. I work with high achieving students I'm working with them one-on-one. I see the problem with them, whether all this created mass they were thrown into, as the previous question said, like have they become guinea pigs? What is the difference between the real knowledge base and that artificial beauty of throwing them into, because the schools really push them to buy iPads, and they can't do not 18. I know teenagers spend 15 hours daily on iPad. Only they can switch off only to go to the toilet or to sleep. So yeah, and
turn it off to go to the toilet.
Yeah, that's right.
And it is a concern, and that's why.
Yeah.
That's why a lot of what I was talking about is about your relationship with your child, and like any behaviour that you want to alter, that you have to engage. I mean, it's not easy. And it's a culture in the school. I don't know if you remember the slide where parents can actually engage with the school and talk about their concerns and see if something can be done at that level.
I think more than that, my question is, as educators and education consultants and psychologists, like where we work with them, even we have to learn, we have to sit and learn the technology as well.
Absolutely.
Because we can't be left out. Otherwise, they would be well ahead of us. So in order to counsel them, we need to have that knowledge base as well. And my question is, are there any research opening for deep analysis and how to learn the difference between what deep education on a topic without technology, and what that knowledge base, and what artificial scenarios, false alarms being created about educational development together with the technology. So that's
yeah, and I don't think it's been done. I think not as far as I've read or know.
Cognitive development is a very, very like unpublished place where people are very, I know most of the practitioners are very scared to talk about that too, because that is where we can't see material things. We can't see material, anything. What we understand about the knowledge thinking, we don't like to tell. So there aren't any research. So that's, yeah. So that's
something for someone else. We've got a project for you, and now we've got another one going.
Yeah.
So thank you for your input.
And thank you, everyone. Nikki will be around for a while, so please feel free to catch up with her, ask any questions, or pursue with email. She'd be more than happy to develop ideas further. Again, Nikki, thank you for a wonderful presentation and a great night. And join me in thanking Nikki. Thank you.